to deceive Hitler and change the course of the conflict. And we will also learn the incredible story of the largest escape ever carried out by prisoners of war, right under the noses of the Nazis. These extraordinary stories are at the heart of today's video in the War Stories series, which you can find exclusively on History in Focus, your favorite channel for history content. Bombs, bloody battles, and genocide are well-known symbols of World War II. But have you ever imagined how ordinary teenagers also became fatal victims of this brutal conflict? Two German youths, only 16 and 17 years old, ended up paying the ultimate price for serving Hitler's ideology. Who were they, and how did they come to such a tragic end? The youngest teenagers executed. During World War II. Throughout World War II, many spies worked in different countries to provide information to the armies. This intelligence was expected to offer a significant advantage in the war. The British, for example, established large spy networks within France that transmitted information and worked as messengers for the French resistance. Special Operations Executive, as it was known, helped carry out many acts of espionage. Those captured while performing these secret tasks were often sent to concentration camps, and many were executed in horrific ways. Another example of this brutality includes several female spies who were even burned alive in concentration camp furnaces. According to reports from other prisoners, their screams were haunting. On the Allied side, several German spies were executed during the war. One was executed inside the Tower of London, the famous medieval fortress where Henry VIII executed two of his own wives. But while England had its intelligence agency, Nazi Germany was willing to go even further to spy on its enemies. The Hitler Youth, an organization established by the Nazis, a group that adolescents joined. This organization was a tool used to indoctrinate other boys and eventually turn them into regime soldiers. It was expected that all youth in this order would one day become motivated soldiers willing to give their lives for the Third Reich. Over time, joining the group became virtually mandatory, and German teenagers faced immense pressure to enlist. About this organization, Hitler said, "These boys and girls enter our organizations at the age of 10. After 4 years, they go on to the Hitler Youth, where they remain for another 4 years. If they still are not complete National Socialists, they go to labor service for 6 or 7 months, and whatever class or social differences remain, the armed forces will eliminate them." Some boys dropped out due to the discipline and regimented nature of the group, but they soon discovered they could not find jobs or even attend university if they were not members. In the end, the main age group in the organization was boys from 14 to 18 years old, and eventually, membership reached 8 million. Once he realized the huge number of youths at his disposal, Hitler understood he could gain wartime advantages through the organization, turning these boys into a useful tool in the war. Thus, during World War II, the Hitler Youth played a key role for Germany. Arthur Axmann changed the order from a simple youth group into an auxiliary force that could perform wartime duties when called upon. The Hitler Youth became part of Germany's fire brigades and took part in civil work, including the Reich Postal Service, railroad operations, and other government tasks. However, many members were trained to operate anti-aircraft defenses and help shoot down Allied aircraft, and they were, of course, vulnerable to attacks. As the war effort continued, the Nazis began turning the Hitler Youth into a new military reserve to eventually replace soldiers killed in action during operations like Barbarossa, where heavy losses had been suffered. As a result, a combat division made up of children born in 1926 was presented to Hitler for approval, and he approved it. In 1944, the Hitler Youth SS Panzer Division was deployed during the Battle of Normandy, and 20,000 young Germans took part in the effort to resist the D-Day landings. They managed to knock out 28 Canadian tanks, but 3,000 members were lost before the Normandy attack even ended. the Hitler Youth Division became known for its loyalty to the Nazi cause and its ferocity. These were dangerous youths who had been brainwashed. And as the war began to turn more and more against Germany, boys as young as 12 were drafted into the Volkssturm to defend the country during the Battle of Berlin. These boys were equipped with weapons such as Panzerfausts and were part of Germany's last line of defense. Thus, as the war neared its final months and Germany was still trying to defend itself, Hitler Youth members also carried out espionage work for the German army. The Nazis believed that sending young people would arouse less suspicion from enemies, allowing them to infiltrate areas being liberated and occupied by the British, Americans, and other Allied forces. Near Braunschweig, Germany, Hitler Youth members were spying on the Allies. They were relaying this information in an attempt to regroup the Germans and strike at the precise locations of American bases. However, the United States Army was aware this was happening and began to treat many locals with suspicion. Girls and women were suspected of being spies. There was even discouragement of socializing with local residents. But on June 1, 1945, two teenagers, one 16 and one 17 years old, were taken to a quarry by American soldiers. But why did these two young men end up there? Heinz Petry, a 16-year-old boy, and Joseph Schoner, a 17-year-old boy, were captured by the Allies and accused of espionage by the Americans. The Army discovered that the duo had been trained in how to use pistols and rifles, as well as how to work with explosives, and that they served in the secret organization Werwolf, which aimed to carry out attacks against the Allies. Schoner was a Hitler Youth leader, and along with others, he was transferred to Berghain. On February 21, 1945, Petry was sent to the front line with Schoner to spy and report back to the Germans on the strength of the United States Army troops. But on February 22, 1945, the two teenagers were caught by the U.S. Army near Bergenheim. They were found hiding in a trench reporting American movements. The U.S. soldiers found the boys in civilian clothing and not in uniform, so they were treated and classified as spies. During interrogation, 16-year-old Petry admitted to being a spy, and both were imprisoned at the Aachen prison. There was a full-day hearing in front of a U.S. military tribunal made up of Army officers. Thus, on March 29, 1945, before a court-martial, both teenagers, despite their young age, were sentenced to death by firing squad for committing acts of espionage harmful to the war effort. The jury of officers reached a 2/3 majority, and the death sentences were carried out to show the German people the seriousness of the Americans' determination to completely eliminate the poisonous Nazi ideology from the face of the earth. Thus, on May 30, 1945, when the war in Europe had ended, the boys were transferred to the Braunschweig Detention Center and were informed that their clemency appeals had been denied. Instead, they were told that their executions were imminent. Heinz Petry, 16, wrote a 6-page farewell letter to his parents and brother the night before his execution. They were taken on a short trip to a nearby quarry, and Petry, being younger, was executed first. He was led to his execution flanked by American guards and a priest who stayed with him. He was then taken to a wooden stake fixed against the gravel bank. The officers tied his arms behind his back and also bound his legs, leaving him restrained. A firing squad of 12 Army soldiers appeared with their rifles. They were not far from their target and were instructed to prepare by the officer standing behind them. Quickly and precisely, they fired straight at the target, and Heinz Petry, 16, was executed. His body was placed in a coffin by German Red Cross workers. After Petry's execution, Schoner was executed in the same manner, along with 4 other spies executed that day by U.S. Army soldiers. The action drew criticism, as some believed the boys should have been spared due to their young age. After the executions, Heinz Petry was buried in Braunschweig's main cemetery, and Joseph Schoner was buried in the Catholic cemetery. Petry's remains were later exhumed at his family's request and transferred back to his hometown. The execution of the teenage Hitler Youth members was seen by some around the world as unnecessary, given that the war in Europe had ended. But for the Americans, it was considered an important step in showing the German population that those who committed crimes against the Allies would be punished, and that it demonstrated to Germans which path they should not follow. But in the end, Heinz Petry was only 16 years old when he was executed at the quarry, and Joseph Schoner was only 17 when he met the same tragic fate. These two remain among the youngest to be executed by the Allies during World War II. If innocent teenagers were not spared from the horrors of war, imagine the fate reserved for the German men who had the courage to turn directly against Hitler. A secret group of high-ranking German army officers risked everything in a bold attempt to assassinate the Führer and change the course of history. But why did this plan fail at the very last moment? Operation Valkyrie. As we know, Nazism was upheld by violence and a network of forced loyalty, but not all Germans passively accepted Adolf Hitler's dark rise. After all, what would the Führer not do to maintain his absolute power? This was likely one of the questions that motivated those responsible for Operation Valkyrie, a daring plan devised by Germans who dared to dream of ending the Nazi regime. Led by high-ranking military officers and German civilians, the plan involved key figures such as Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who played a central role in the assassination attempt. But what happened to cause the plan to fail? And most importantly, what was the fate of those who dared to betray the dictator in the midst of war? Throughout World War II, it was well known that Nazi-controlled Germany operated through an almost unstoppable terror machine. Elite troops, well-equipped divisions, and a brutal secret police, the Gestapo, ensured that any dissent was crushed. But behind the scenes, groups of conspirators were trying to remove Hitler from power before the entire country sank into ruin. Among them was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. From offices in Berlin, he and other senior officers discussed plans that could end the regime and prevent further disasters for Germany. The idea of a coup was not new. Since Hitler's expansionist ambitions had led the country to the brink, many traditional military officers, deeply troubled by the direction of Nazism, had considered taking decisive action. However, a precise moment and a meticulous plan were required, as any failure would not only seal the fate of the conspirators, but also trigger even more brutal retaliation from the regime. And so Operation Valkyrie was born. The German High Command, always fearful of internal revolts, had a contingency plan to maintain order in the event of civil unrest or disasters that could destabilize the Reich. The conspirators planned to use this same plan against Hitler himself. If they could eliminate him, they would activate Operation Valkyrie under the pretext that traitors were attempting to seize power. This way, they would not raise immediate suspicion and could take control of Berlin, detain top Nazi leaders, and negotiate a more favorable peace with the Allies. While countries like England, the United States, and others sought Hitler's downfall through military strategy, internally in Germany, some Wehrmacht officers were willing to risk everything in a secret and dangerous mission. After all, how many lives could be saved if they succeeded in killing the dictator and stopping the war? But of course, the path to this attempt was riddled with espionage, secret codes, and deep fear of betrayal within the German army itself. On July 20, 1944, at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, known as the Wolf's Lair, Wolfschanze, Stauffenberg brought a briefcase with explosives and placed it as close to the Führer as possible during a meeting of officers. It was meant to be one decisive strike. The explosion would kill Hitler and clear the way for Operation Valkyrie to be immediately set in motion. However, small details were enough to ruin the plan. The bomb was activated, and Stauffenberg left the room under the pretense of making a phone call. The briefcase containing the bomb was moved behind a heavy oak table, which ended up muffling the impact of the explosion on Hitler. Curiously, the bomb used by Stauffenberg contained about 2 pounds of plastic explosives, but its effectiveness was reduced because he was only able to activate half of the material. Additionally, the heat and the many open windows in the room helped dissipate the blast. Hitler survived, even ordering that the destroyed table be preserved as a historical relic. It was taken to his bunker in Berlin, where it remained until the final days of the war. The failed assassination attempt triggered a brutal wave of repression. 4 people were killed in the blast, but the dictator escaped with minor injuries, protected by the fortuitous positioning of objects in the room. Stauffenberg, initially believing he had succeeded, returned to Berlin to initiate the second phase of the plan. However, when the conspirators realized the Führer was still alive, it was already too late. Though they tried to activate Operation Valkyrie to mobilize the army in the capital, the reaction from commanders loyal to Hitler was swift and merciless. The Gestapo, already well practiced in hunting traitors, received orders to find everyone involved as quickly as possible. Stauffenberg and his companions were quickly identified and arrested. That same day, he and other conspirators, such as General Friedrich Olbricht and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, were executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the Bendler Block, the Army's headquarters in Berlin. Stauffenberg died shouting, "Long live sacred Germany!" In the days and weeks that followed, the Gestapo arrested and interrogated hundreds of suspects. The executions were filmed and photographed, and the images were shown to Hitler as proof of the regime's vengeance. Henning von Treschow, one of the main conspirators, committed suicide before he could be captured. In his final words, he said, "Now the whole world will condemn us, but I still believe we did the right thing." In total, hundreds of people connected to or suspected of involvement in the plot were arrested, tortured, and sentenced to death. Among them were civilians, nobles, officers, businessmen, and even relatives and acquaintances of the conspirators. No one was spared from the Nazi wrath. The trials were nothing more than macabre formalities. Many were executed in cruel ways, hanged with piano wire in prisons or concentration camps under Hitler's direct orders, who wanted to make a terrifying example of them. Later, it was recorded that Hitler's reaction was one of extreme rage upon learning that officers from his own army had conspired against him. "They will die a disgraceful death," he is said to have declared, with a tone of disdain and hatred that was evident in the executions. Thus, Operation Valkyrie ended tragically for those involved. Many historians wonder, could the war have ended sooner if Hitler had been killed that day? How many lives could have been saved, or how many cities spared from destruction? Yet the events that followed showed that even within one of history's most brutal regimes, there were still people willing to risk everything to free their country from Nazi rule. The failed plot also strengthened the myth of Hitler's invincibility in the eyes of some Germans, even though, in practice, the war continued to turn increasingly against Germany. For the regime, the executions served as a warning to the rest of the country. Anyone who opposed Hitler would face the worst possible retaliation. The conspirators, many of whom were patriots who had served the regime, risked everything in an attempt to save Germany and the world from the horror of Nazism. Their actions show that even in a totalitarian regime, there is room for individual and collective resistance. After the war, the conspirators were initially viewed with suspicion by many Germans who considered them traitors. However, over the decades, their reputation was rehabilitated, and today they are celebrated as heroes. Klaus von Stauffenberg, in particular, became a symbol of German resistance, and his story was portrayed in films such as Valkyrie, 2008, starring Tom Cruise. In 1953, the Bendler Block, where Stauffenberg and other conspirators were executed, was transformed into a memorial dedicated to German resistance. Trained officers, sophisticated weapons, and strategic planning nearly succeeded in taking Hitler's life. But did you know that a simple carpenter, acting alone and without support from any organized group, came even closer to achieving that historic feat years earlier? Meet Georg Elser, the man who was just 13 minutes away from preventing World War II before it even began. Individual resistance, Georg Elser. Georg Elser was a German carpenter who acted alone in his attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. His story is one of the most remarkable examples of individual resistance against the Nazi regime, showing how an ordinary person driven by deep convictions could defy one of the most brutal regimes in history. Johann Georg Elser was born on January 4, 1903, in Hermeringen, a small town in southern Germany. He grew up in a humble family and worked as a carpenter and watchmaker, professions that required precision and patience, skills that would later prove crucial to his plan. Elser was not politically active, but observed with growing concern the rise of Hitler and the impact of the Nazi regime on German life. He saw Nazism as a threat to peace and freedom and decided he had to act. Interestingly, Elser had no ties to organized resistance groups such as the White Rose or the Communist Party. He acted entirely on his own, motivated by his conscience and the conviction that Hitler had to be stopped at any cost. In 1939, Elser began meticulously planning his attack. He chose the Burger Bräukeller, a beer hall in Munich, where Hitler was scheduled to give a speech on November 8th during the annual commemoration of the Beer Hall Putsch. This event marked Hitler's failed 1923 coup and was one of the most symbolic dates on the Nazi calendar. Elser gained access to the location days before the event and, over several nights, hid in the basement of the beer hall after it closed. He used his carpentry skills to install a homemade bomb in a column near the stage where Hitler would speak. The bomb was built using materials he had collected himself, including dynamite, stolen from a quarry where he worked. He set the device to explode at 9:20 p.m. during Hitler's speech, estimating that the dictator would be at the height of his rhetoric, surrounded by Nazi leaders. Elser spent more than 30 nights secretly working inside the beer hall, hiding after it closed, and leaving before it reopened each morning. He used a small lantern to light his workspace and covered the sounds of his activity with background noise, such as the clinking of bottles. On the night of November 8, 1939, the bomb exploded exactly as planned, destroying part of the building and killing 8 people. However, Hitler had left the venue earlier than expected, escaping unscathed by just 13 minutes. The dictator credited his survival to divine providence, but it was actually a change in schedule due to bad weather that saved him. Hitler needed to return to Berlin early because World War II had begun 2 months earlier, and he had urgent meetings. Elser's bomb was so powerful that it destroyed part of the ceiling and walls of the beer hall. Had Hitler remained at the site, he and several top Nazi leaders would likely have been killed, potentially changing the course of the war. The Gestapo launched an intense investigation, and Elser was arrested at the Swiss border while trying to flee the country. He was carrying suspicious materials, including bomb sketches and a membership card for a communist union, which raised suspicions. Under torture, Elser confessed to the attack, but insisted he had acted alone with no connection to resistance groups or foreign powers. Despite the Gestapo's suspicion that he was part of a larger conspiracy, it was never proven that Elser had any accomplices. During interrogations, Elser was subjected to brutal torture, including beatings and sleep deprivation. Still, he maintained that he had acted alone, demonstrating impressive resolve. Elser was held in custody for years, initially as a special prisoner. Elser was held in relatively better conditions than other prisoners, as the Nazis still hoped to use him for propaganda. He had access to newspapers and even a radio, which allowed him to follow the progress of the war. The Nazis planned to use him in a show trial after the war to claim that he had acted on behalf of the British. However, with Germany's defeat imminent, he was executed on April 9, 1945, at the Dachau concentration camp, just weeks before the war ended. His death was kept secret, and he was officially recorded as a victim of an Allied bombing. Georg Elser's story is a powerful reminder that resistance can come from the most unexpected places. He was not a politician, soldier, or intellectual, just an ordinary man who decided to act against injustice. Today, Elser is remembered as a silent hero. In 2011, a memorial was inaugurated in his honor in Berlin, near the place where he was arrested. His story has also been portrayed in films and documentaries, such as the 2015 movie Elzer, which tells the story of his life and his assassination attempt. Failed assassination attempts marked the war against Hitler. But what if I told you that one of the Führer's greatest strategic defeats came not from armed soldiers or bombs, but from a carefully prepared corpse designed to deceive him? Discover how the Allies used a dead man to execute one of the most ingenious espionage operations in history, changing the fate of Europe. Operation Mincemeat, the corpse that fooled Hitler and changed the course of the war. On April 30th, 1943, a body in military uniform washed ashore near Huelva, Spain. The Germans, believing they were gaining access to valuable intelligence, were actually falling into a meticulous trap set by the Allies, one so cunning that even Hitler could not imagine it. This was Operation Mincemeat, one of the most brilliant counterintelligence strategies of World War II. The original idea came from Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, the same man who would later create the character James Bond. As assistant to the director of British Naval Intelligence, Fleming had been inspired by a 1939 spy novel titled The Milliner's Hat Mystery, in which a corpse is used to deceive criminals. Commander Ewan Montague, a brilliant lawyer and naval officer, led the execution of the operation. Equally crucial, though less known, was pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who advised on how to preserve the body to make it appear as a recent drowning victim. Finding the right body was a major challenge. The team needed a corpse that appeared to have drowned in a sea crash with no visible injuries. In January 1943, Glyndwr Michael, a 34-year-old Welshman with no close family, died after ingesting rat poison containing phosphorus. He was the perfect candidate. In a macabre twist, to preserve the body for months, it was stored in a refrigerated container at the Hackney mortuary. Doctors injected liquid nitrogen into the lungs to simulate drowning effects and carefully treated the tissues to slow natural decomposition. Creating Major William Martin required extraordinary attention to detail. Montague and his team developed an entire identity. In his pocket were a photograph of his fictional fiancée, Pam, actually MI5 employee Jean Leslie, 2 scented love letters written by Pam, a receipt for an engagement ring from S.J. Phillips Jewelers on Bond Street, used tickets to a London theater show dated April 22nd, a hotel bill from the Naval and Military Club, a worn ID card aged using boot polish to suggest prolonged use, an angry letter from Lloyd's Bank about an overdraft of £79 and 97 pence, equivalent to £3,700 today, keys, coins, cigarettes, and even a St. Christopher medal. Even more remarkable, British intelligence officers planted a subtle clue about Major Martin's temperament. A reproachful letter from his father over his financial recklessness, suggesting he was careless enough to be trusted with highly classified documents. Meanwhile, the real treasure lay in Martin's briefcase, a personal letter from Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten to the Allied commander in North Africa. The letter casually mentioned that Husky, the actual code name for the invasion of Sicily, was just a distraction and that the main targets were Greece and Sardinia. The submarine HMS Seraph, commanded by Lieutenant Norman Jewell, transported the body to the Spanish coast. At 4:30 a.m. on April 30th, the crew performed a curious ceremony. They dressed the body in a life jacket, recited a psalm over it, and released it into the sea with a fire extinguisher tied to ensure it drifted toward shore. The plan depended on the Spanish finding the body and passing the documents to the Germans while returning them to the British without arousing suspicion. This was feasible because Spain, though officially neutral, sympathized with the Axis and allowed German intelligence agents to operate on its soil. German agent Adolf Klaus in Huelva secretly photographed the documents before they were returned to the British. The documents reached Hitler's desk, and he believed them entirely. On May 12th, he issued Führer Directive No. 48, ordering reinforcements to Greece and Sardinia. Measures to reinforce the Mediterranean islands must proceed. Sardinia and the Peloponnese must be top priority. The Abwehr, German intelligence, sent urgent messages to its agents confirming. Documents from English Major are genuine. They foretell an invasion of Greece and Sardinia with diversionary operations against southern France, Calabria, and Sicily. The German High Command shifted the idle panzer group in France to Greece, sent 2 divisions from the Eastern Front to the Balkans, bolstered defenses in Sardinia, and, crucially, reduced forces in Sicily. The British received definitive confirmation of success via ultra-decryption of Enigma codes. A message intercepted on May 14th from German High Command ordered preparations to defend Greece and Sardinia, but not Sicily. An interesting post-war discovery was that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had raised doubts about the authenticity of the documents, but was ignored by superiors who wanted to believe the content. General Alfred Jodl even wrote in his diary, "Sicily, as the main target, is now completely ruled out." As a result, when 160,000 Allied troops landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, they encountered only 2 German divisions instead of 6 or more that could have been there. German General Hans Valentin Hube had been explicitly ordered by Hitler to treat the invasion of Sicily as a mere diversion. The conquest of Sicily was completed in just 38 days, with approximately 24,850 Allied casualties, a significantly lower number than feared. This led to Mussolini's fall on July 25th and Italy's surrender in September, shortening the war by several months. The operation remained an absolute secret for years. It was only revealed in 1953 when Ewan Montague published the book The Man Who Never Was. Even then, key details remained classified until the 1990s. One ironic detail: early on, the Germans suspected the body might be a trap, but concluded the British would never use a real corpse for such an operation, underestimating the resolve of their adversaries. Operation Mincemeat remains a testament to the power of human imagination in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. It was a victory not of strength, but of creativity and audacity. A true story stranger and more brilliant than any fiction. A corpse deceived Hitler and influenced the outcome of a crucial battle. But could an entire prison camp, guarded by hundreds of Nazi soldiers trained to prevent any escape attempt, be fooled as well? Discover now the incredible story of more than 70 Allied prisoners who defied all odds, carrying out the most daring and impressive escape of World War II. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, the daring plan that defied the Nazis. On the night of March 24, 1944, at the height of World War II, something extraordinary happened at the Stalag Luft III prisoner of war camp in Germany. A man emerged from a small hole in the ground, looked around carefully, and crawled away. Then another followed, and another. One of the most daring and well-organized escapes in military history had begun. Stalag Luft III was no ordinary prison camp. The Germans had specifically designed it to be escape-proof. Located near the town of Sagin in present-day Poland, the camp had several security features. Prisoner barracks were raised off the ground so guards could detect tunneling activity. Microphones were buried around the perimeter to detect digging sounds. And the soil was made of yellow sand, which easily collapsed during excavation and stained clothing, revealing anyone trying to move it. The prisoners were mostly Allied airmen, pilots, navigators, and gunners captured during bombing missions over Europe. Among them was squadron leader Roger Bushell, a Royal Air Force pilot who had already attempted to escape from other camps twice. In January 1943, Bushell gathered fellow prisoners and proposed an ambitious plan. Instead of digging a single tunnel, he suggested they dig 3 simultaneously, reasoning that if one were discovered, the others could still be used. He also proposed that not just a few men should escape, but 200, all at once. Many thought the plan was impossible, but Bushell was persuasive. He organized the prisoners into specialized teams, each with a specific role in the operation. In total, more than 600 men participated in the project. The 3 tunnels were named Tom, Dick, and Harry. Each extended in a different direction from separate points within the camp. The engineering behind these tunnels was impressive, especially given the limitations. They were dug 9 meters deep, deeper than any previous escape attempts, to avoid detection by microphones, and were only about 60 centimeters wide and tall, just enough for a man to crawl through. The tunnel walls were reinforced using boards taken from the prisoners' beds. To hide the missing slats, some beds were patched with cardboard and earth so inspections would not notice. Over 4,000 powdered milk cans were flattened and repurposed as structural supports. One of the biggest challenges was ventilation. At such depths, air quickly became unbreathable. The prisoners created a system using cans linked as pipes, with a hand-operated bellows at the entrance to pump in fresh air. The bellows were made from wood and leather salvaged from old boots. To light the tunnels, they first used lamps improvised from margarine. Later, they managed to steal electrical wires from the camp and install a better lighting system. They even built a small cart on rails to transport diggers and soil through the tunnels. Another major issue was what to do with all the excavated sand. A 100-meter tunnel produced tons of earth that had to be discreetly hidden. The solution was ingenious. Prisoners sewed special pouches inside their pants, filled them with sand, and slowly scattered it around the camp during daily walks. These men were called penguins because of their waddling gait with sand-filled trousers. Other prisoners made civilian clothing from unraveled uniforms, and some forged identity papers so convincingly that they could fool German guards. The level of coordination and organization was like that of a small industrial operation. In September 1943, the Germans discovered Tunnel Tom, a harsh blow after so much work. Tunnel Dick was temporarily abandoned and converted into a storage site for materials. All hopes now rested on Tunnel Harry. The work on Harry faced another setback when the Germans built new barracks directly above the planned route. The diggers had to reroute the tunnel, significantly extending its length. In the end, Harry stretched 102 meters. On the night of March 24, 1944, everything was ready. The escape was timed for a moonless night. 200 men, each equipped with civilian clothes, forged documents, and food for the journey, secretly gathered in Hut 104, ready to leave in small groups throughout the night. But the first problem arose immediately. Upon opening the tunnel's exit, they discovered it ended short of the planned spot. Instead of emerging into the forest, it surfaced in an open field, close to a guard tower. In addition, the cold night air made the fugitives' breath visible as vapor. Still, Bushell decided to proceed. The prisoners began crawling out one by one, carefully making their way toward the forest cover. Progress was slow. The cold air and the stale atmosphere inside the tunnel caused several men to faint, further delaying the escape. Around 1 a.m., more problems arose. A nearby Allied bombing raid caused a temporary power outage in the camp, complicating the already difficult passage through the dark tunnel. The tunnel also began to collapse in places from overuse. At 4:45 a.m., a guard spotted movement near the forest and raised the alarm. By that time, only 76 of the planned 200 escapees had gotten out. Searchlights swept the grounds, alarms blared, and the entire camp was put on high alert. The 76 escapees were already scattered, each following a different escape plan. Some tried to reach the coast to find boats. Others headed for the borders of neutral countries. Some planned to use trains, disguised as civilians or soldiers on leave. When Hitler learned of the escape, he was furious and ordered one of the largest manhunts of the war. Over 73,000 German troops were mobilized, train stations were shut down, roads were watched, and the Gestapo was given top priority to locate the fugitives. Within 2 weeks, 73 of the 76 escapees were recaptured. Only 3 managed full escapes. Norwegian pilots Per Bergsland and Jens Müller, who reached Sweden aboard a fishing boat, and Dutch pilot Bram van der Stok, who crossed France with help from the resistance and reached Spain. What followed turned an act of bravery into a tragedy. Outraged by the international embarrassment caused by the escape, Hitler initially ordered that all recaptured men be executed. After internal debate among top Nazi officials, the number was reduced to 50. Those selected were told they would be transferred back to the camp. Instead, in small groups, they were taken to remote locations and executed in cold blood by the Gestapo. Among the murdered was Roger Bushel, the mastermind of the escape. The ashes of the executed men were sent back to Stalag Luft III in urns. The camp's commandant, von Lindiner-Wildau, was horrified by this blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions, which prohibited the execution of prisoners of war. He refused to accept the urns and was subsequently removed from command and sent to fight on the dangerous Eastern Front. When the Allies learned of the executions, global outrage followed. Winston Churchill vowed the perpetrators would be brought to justice, and after the war, the murder of the 50 prisoners was included in the war crimes trials. The responsible individuals were pursued for many years, with the last being captured in the 1970s. The Great Escape had a significant impact on the war. The resources Germany had to commit to recapturing the fugitives, tens of thousands of troops and police, were diverted from the front lines at a critical moment. More importantly, the escape demonstrated what determined individuals could accomplish even under the harshest conditions. With no proper tools and under constant surveillance, these men created a remarkable feat of engineering. They improvised everything from basic tools to complex ventilation and transport systems. After the war, Paul Brickhill, one of the prisoners who helped plan the escape but did not participate due to claustrophobia, wrote The Great Escape in 1950. The book was adapted into the famous 1963 film starring Steve McQueen, though it included several fictional elements. In 1950, the families of the executed men erected a memorial at the site of the former camp. A plaque with the names of the 50 men serves as a permanent tribute to their sacrifice. One of the survivors, British pilot Jimmy James,